Chapter 14. Dre. The Tunnel. Dre couldn't help himself. He really couldn't. He turned his head once again, until he could see the teeming mass of corruption surging behind him out of the corner of his eye. It couldn't be true, and yet it was. They were gaining on him. The first few times he had looked back, he had been able to at least partially convince himself that the monsters weren't really getting any closer. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, right? This time, though, it was too obvious for self-deception. He was running as fast as he could, burdened as he was, and even with the substantial speed boost from Adian's skill, he just wasn't fast enough. It wasn't just him, either. A few militia members had the skills to outrun the monsters, but the vast majority didn't. They were going to make it to the tunnel before they were caught, but they would surely be caught. Dre's desperate hope that they could escape this place without another terrible battle was dead. Fighting the beasts in the tunnel would be better than fighting them in the cavern, but that was kind of like saying dying from a single wound to the heart was better than dying from 50 stab wounds to the stomach. It may be true, but either way death was inevitable. Dre couldn't imagine that their tiny force would be able to withstand the coming tide, but maybe he could do something to help. The tunnel was larger than the one they had previously been heading towards, but it really wasn't all that large. Could he block it with stuff from his pack? The moment the idea crossed his panicked mind, he latched onto it like a drowning man to driftwood. Anything he could do to slow the horde had to be a good thing, right? Besides, the more stuff he got out of his pack, the lighter it would be, and the more quickly he would be able to run. Perhaps best of all, though, was that the vast majority of the stuff that could work as part of a barrier was all the useless stuff that the captain had forced Dre to take. At the time, he had been flustered, and he hadn't thought much about it. Looking back at the situation now, Rucker had just been a total jerk. When Adian had made the militiamen retrieve the unnecessary stuff that they had given him, Dre had refrained from mentioning Captain Rucker's excess, partly because he didn't want to be viewed as a snitch by the militiamen, but also because he had thought that bringing the captain and Adian back into conflict would only lead to trouble. He had deeply regretted his cowardly decision for the entire journey to the cave. Carrying a useful burden was one thing. It was easy to rationalize suffering while doing so, but carrying what was essentially the entirety of one man's belongings on a scouting trip, that was something else entirely. All this ran through Dre's head as he approached the tunnel entrance. He intentionally slowed down his pace so that Adian was slightly ahead of him. Right as they entered the tunnel, Dre came to an abrupt halt. He turned around, his breath coming heavy, to see the progress of the diseased monsters. When he caught sight of how close they were, his heart almost stopped. He didn't have nearly enough time. Even still, he pulled off his pack and began grabbing everything that might be slightly useful out of it. He retrieved a couple of large chests. The captain hadn't deigned to inform him of the contents. He pulled out some rugs and a bunch of chairs. He extracted 10 large ropes, a bunch of clothes, and even a couple large barrels of what he presumed to be alcohol. He had to basically dump those things out of his pack. He did it all in only a few panicked moments thanks to his quick retrieve skill. He looked upon his creation and gulped. It wasn't going to stop anything. It was all piled on a large mound that mostly covered the width of the tunnel, but only reached halfway up its height. It might be inconvenient for the first few creatures, but his pitiful barrier wouldn't last more than a few heartbeats before the furious momentum of the horde. But what could he do? Add more militia equipment to the pile? Sacrifice some of Adian's instruments to the cause? Run? But even as he started to panic, an idea that had been tickling his mind since he had pulled out the barrels came to the forefront. What was it that all animals feared? What was it that every camp was built around, and had been used to deter unwanted creatures since the beginning of civilization? Fire. Dre knocked the top of the mound to the sides so that it completely covered the width and extended more into the tunnel. He made sure to place 2 of the barrels near the center of the now scattered pile. He then took out a large sword he had used earlier and, with a powerful swing, cut a corner off of the last, much smaller barrel. He quickly sniffed it and winced before a smile spread across his dirt-covered face. That was strong stuff, way too strong to be reasonable, but hopefully that meant it would burn hot and quickly. He splashed the barrel's alcoholic content over everything and then tossed the half-empty barrel into the middle of the pile. He hurriedly put on his pack, yanked out a flint and knife, and started to frantically create sparks over the back edge of the pile. But they weren't catching. Why weren't they catching? He struck the flint with reckless, chaotic abandon. He could hear steps approaching from behind him, but more importantly, he could hear hisses and growls in front of him. They were here. Suddenly, he was grabbed from behind by his pack and pulled backwards, away from the pile. He struggled for a panicked instant before primal fear overtook his logical reasoning. As he was getting pulled backwards, another figure dashed forward, glowing torch in hand, and threw it into the center of the alcohol-soaked pile. For a heart-rending moment, nothing happened. But then, with a great whoosh, flames roared to life. Dre stared in relief at the flames, and at the whining creatures who shied away from them on the outside of the tunnel. That had been close. Too close. Before he could dwell too long on just how close he had come to death, his attention was pulled to the figure that was walking away from the flames. After a moment or two, he recognized the torchbearer to be Marcia. He could feel his jaw slowly drop as the light of the fire reflected off her striking features. A member of Adian's team had come to the rescue. No, that wasn't the correct way to think about it anymore. Marcia was Dre's comrade now as well. He had been saved by a member of his own team. The Swordmaster looked at Dre, with a slightly strained smile on her face. Dre smiled in return, but he could feel his cheeks flush red as he did so. After a moment, she spoke. "That was quick thinking, Dre. We all know animals hate fire." She kept speaking, but a flash of movement through the flames caught Dre's attention. By the time his mind interpreted what he was seeing, it was already too late. One of the cat creatures dashed towards the burning wreckage. With a mighty leap, it soared into the air. Its pointed ears scraped the top of the tunnel, and tongues of fire licked at its underbelly, but neither did anything to deter the creature's deadly trajectory. Even as Dre opened his mouth to shout a warning to Marcia, he subconsciously noticed that the monster was at least twice the size of others its kind. Its massive teeth and dagger-like claws gleamed in the firelight, but not nearly as brightly as the terrible green glow of its feline eyes. Before any sound managed to leave Dre's lips, it landed on top of Marcia with a sickening crunch. She screamed in surprise and pain, but the terrible sound was cut off suddenly as the sickly monster buried its fangs deep into her throat. Dre was frozen in place. He couldn't move, except for the involuntary, uncontrollable trembling that had seized his body. He watched in utter terror as the creature slowly looked up and locked eyes on him, as blood dripped from its gaping jaws. The monster crouched, its powerful muscles compressing like a spring as it prepared for another terrible leap. Dre heard someone scream. By the time he realized that the sound was being torn out of his own throat, the diseased cat was already descending towards him. Moments before Dre was crushed by the creature, two things occurred simultaneously. Something silver flashed by his face, and a mighty tug on his pack dragged him backwards. The murderous feline thudded to the rocky ground where he had just sat. It slid forward until it came to a stop no more than a few hairs' breadth away, a shiny arrow protruding out of its left eye socket. Dre only had a moment to watch as green pus leaked from the wound like rotten, viscous blood. Then he was once again being pulled from behind. After a few long moments of scrabbling backwards, the tension on his pack released, and he turned to see a pale-faced Adian beckoning him up the tunnel. "We can't stay here," he yelled. He turned and picked up the marching drum from where it lay tipped over beside him and began playing a panicked, uneven beat. Then he ran. Dre instinctually followed. His primal urges took control of his body as his mind tried and failed to process what he had just seen. He passed by a figure, and it took him a moment to realize that it was a rage-filled Olive, who screamed as he fired glowing arrows towards the flame-filled entrance. Dre turned his head, even as he ran, and watched a blue-streaked arrow strike another cat creature in the side while it was still airborne. The arrow struck like a hammer blow, and the monster's momentum was halted entirely. It fell directly into the center of the flames. Its angry snarling quickly turned into a pained squealing. He didn't know how or when she had gotten down there, but he also saw a shadowy figure moving at odds with the flickering firelight, a knife grasped in each hand. Miana seemed to disappear and then reappear at will, always from one killing blow to another as more and more of the crazed creatures leapt across the burning pile. "Come on, guys!" Adian shouted from up the tunnel. Dre turned his attention back to what was in front of him, but he heard Olive respond in shouted spurts, interrupted at consistent intervals by the thrum of his bowstring. "Get the kid out of here! We'll hold them off and try to thin the horde." The words pushed Dre to run even faster. With his pack substantially lightened, he felt nearly weightless, even as he ran up the steep incline. He didn't allow himself to think about whether he was running away from monsters or from his terrible mistake. Just as the tunnel began to flatten out beneath his feet, there was a deafening blast from behind him. He was flung violently forward by a wave of searing heat. He landed in a crumpled heap upon the ground. He lay there, dazed. His ears rang and his head spun. He wanted to just stay there, to give up. But then he had a horrible thought. He slowly crawled back to the edge of the downward slope. He pushed through his dizziness to focus on the sight below. The tunnel, which had been fully dark except for the light that managed to seep in through the mouth of the tunnel from the cave, was now bright with flickering firelight. Dre couldn't comprehend what had happened. The contents of the burning pile he had created were strewn along the length of the tunnel. A burning chair leg lay no more than a few paces in front of him. Corpses were intermingled with the debris. Dre couldn't help but let out a whimper when he counted 3 corpses that were undeniably human in form. It was at that moment that he became aware of a terrible scent assaulting his nostrils, a horrid mix of the acrid smell of burning fur and hair combined with the sickly sweet smell of frying meat. For the second time in recent days, Dre found himself vomiting violently. He didn't stop after his stomach had been emptied either. He dry-heaved until the smoke caught in his lungs and forced a painful fit of coughing. When he finally regained his breath, he wiped the filth from his lips and turned away from the tunnel entrance. He was surprised to see Adian, unmoving in front of him, his body awkwardly arched around the drum that had been strapped to his front. Even more surprising was that there was no one else in the tunnel. The rest of the militia was just gone, even Gavin. Dre ran up to Adian and rolled him over. He removed the drum and quickly put it in his pack. He called out for Adian to get up. There was no reply from the limp man. The slow rise and fall of his chest was the only indication that he was still alive. Blood covered his face from a gash on his forehead and what looked like a broken nose. His shirt had been mostly burned off his back, revealing raw, bubbling flesh. Dre was also sure that he would have extreme bruising from where the drum had stopped his fall. So, it was with as much care as could be managed with his recently improved strength that he picked Adian up in his arms and cradled him, almost like he would a baby. He had to help him. It was the least he could do after getting 3 of his team members killed. He had no choice but to once again try and act the hero, because no one would be coming to the rescue. So Dre did the only thing he could. He ran. He started out slowly, but quickly increased his pace as he realized that with his improved body, running while carrying someone was easy. He kept increasing his pace until he was sprinting as fast as he could. His steps were quickened by the frantic rhythm of his heart, even as he felt dragged down by the new weight stored there. He had known that his pack could magically contain more, much more than it should be able to, because of its spatial magic. What he hadn't known is that his heart could do the same.